Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
You're listening to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, and this is your weekly reminder to take up big space in life, laugh loudly, absorb new knowledge, and continue to grow and expand. What She Said is your space for the big conversations that matter and the little joys that make life sweeter. This is where empowerment meets self-care and mansplaining has no seat at the table. So grab a coffee, get comfy, and let's jump into it because life's too short not to embrace the good stuff while we tackle the tough stuff.
But specifically around vaccination of young people, Australia vaccinated everybody from 11 to 26 right away, and then continued vaccinating catch-up years. And Australia is now on track to eradicate cervical cancer.
Wow.
2035 is their current estimate as to when there will no longer be measurable numbers of cervical cancer in their population.
That's Dr. Kim Alexander, and this week's show is short and sweet because the information being presented is so clear and backed by such strong data that there's no need to overcomplicate it. The HPV vaccine works. Full stop. It's a proven life-saving tool that prevents cancer, and if there's one vaccine we should all agree on, it's this one. So I encourage you to listen, take in the facts, and most importantly, share this episode widely. This is the kind of information that can change lives. Dr. Kim Alexander is a Canadian obstetrician and gynecologist based in Brampton, Ontario, whose practice focuses on HPV disease and vulvar health. She would like to retire someday. Beyond her medical practice, she's also a certified facilitator for the OWL, Our Whole Lives, comprehensive sexual education curriculum, and has been educating high school students since 2012. Additionally, she's designed workshops for adults, helping people explore healthy sexuality in meaningful ways. Now let's hear what she said. So the HPV vaccine is often misunderstood, especially among parents. Why do you think there's so much hesitancy around it? And what do you want parents to understand about its importance?
Sure. I think there's a predominant thought in North America that the best way to keep our kids safe around sex and sexuality is by limiting their access to information. And when we actually look at the data around healthy sexual behaviors like teen pregnancy rates and STI rates, what we find is that kids who have more knowledge actually have safer behaviors. So I think there's really this thought that's really predominant in the way our society is right now, that the way we protect our kids is just by pretending none of this exists. There's also with any vaccine, there's something called one of our confirmation biases, that we're much more worried about doing something that may cause harm than we are about doing nothing, even if the risk of harm is greater with inaction. That's a really common bias that all of us run into. So when parents start to think about sex and sexuality and their kids and all of the worry that comes with these emerging issues as we come into adolescence, that it just feels safer to do nothing, even when in real life we actually have higher risks associated with vaccine hesitancy.
My daughters are, early 20s, and I remember when this vaccine was sort of still just come out, it was going into the schools and they were making it mandatory for everybody. So now we have roughly 20 some odd years, probably even more data behind it. So what does the data tell us about the success rate of this vaccine?
So this vaccine is wildly effective. So in Australia, they did a way better job than we did with getting the vaccine out right away. So in Ontario, they said, well, we're going to start vaccinating kids in grade 7. In Australia, they said this vaccine initially had indication up to age 26. Now it has indication up to age 46, and NACI guidelines support use beyond that. But specifically around vaccination of young people, Australia vaccinated everybody from 11 to 26 right away, and then continued vaccinating catch-up years. And Australia is now on track to eradicate cervical cancer.
Wow.
2035 is their current estimate as to when there will no longer be measurable numbers of cervical cancer in their population.
That's phenomenal. So, and a lot of people still think that the HPV vaccine is only for girls. Can you explain why it's just as important for boys and men to get vaccinated and the broader benefits this brings?
Absolutely. So, HPV tends to cause cancers in areas where there's transformation zones, which is where the skin type cells meet the glandular type cells in the body. And there's 3 major transformation zones. One is in the cervix, another is in the anus, and the third is in the tongue and base of tonsils. So we tend to see HPV-related cancers commonly in these areas. Now, rates of tonsillar cancer are higher in men than they are in women. And in fact, rates of tonsillar cancer in men are higher than even cervical cancer rates in women. And for men, there's no test for HPV and there's no screening. Like for cervical disease, we all get our pap test. So there's routine screening that goes on. But in the tongue and tonsils, we haven't yet identified a predictable precancer lesion. So there's no way to protect our boys from developing a cancer. With people with cervixes, we can keep an eye on things and hopefully catch problems before they become cancers. And for our boys and our male friends and partners, there's no availability for that. They present with metastatic cancer. So there's no test, there's no prevention. All we can do is vaccinate for really ultimate protection and prevention of viral disease for our male friends and partners.
We're talking about the success of Australia. I think we need to come over now and talk a little bit here because the HPV vaccination rates in Ontario have dropped significantly, especially during the pandemic. What are the consequences of this decline? How can we reverse the trend?
My attempts to reverse the trend have been really just to do as much education as I can. When I see patients in my office who've been diagnosed with cervical precancers who we're treating, I really talk to them about talking to their friends, talking to their neighbors, just spreading the word as much as they can, and reminding people that this vaccine is safe. It's not associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's not associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not associated with all of the things that we worry about when it comes to vaccination. This vaccine isn't associated with those things. And we have so much safety data from young people all over the world because this vaccine has been administered in measured ways across so many different jurisdictions. Reminding parents just to check up on, especially after pandemic, make sure that you call your local public health unit and make sure that everybody got the vaccines that they need to get. And just supporting each other in our parenting.
So I'm going to be the one to ask the dumb question because that's my role. I'm not sure. I know with something like shingles, for example, you can have shingles and still get the vaccine later on. Is the same thing possible with this vaccine? Like you may have had it and been treated and you can still get the vaccine?
Yeah, so COVID has actually been a really good model in terms of talking about HPV because with COVID, you can get COVID once and then get COVID again once you've recovered. And the same thing is true with HPV. So most people, so HPV is incredibly common. Almost 80% of people will get it. You will get it. Your children will get it. Most of us clear the virus. With young people, it takes about 2 years on average. As we get into our 40s, it takes more than 4 years on average. But you do clear it, but you don't necessarily have immunity that will remember and defend you from this virus again. Similar to how COVID doesn't activate the full immune system for most people, HPV tends to hide in the skin type cells where the immune system can't get at it through the blood system. So you can be infected once and recover and be infected again and again, whereas the vaccine provides lifelong immunity. The vaccine also protects you from 9 different strains of HPV, and most of us have not been infected with all 9 strains. So it offers long-standing protection and it offers wide protection.
So you offer education in your office, but let's talk about education in the schools, because there's been a lot of debate around the sex education curriculum in Canadian schools. So from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges with sex education in Canada, and why is it so important that we get this right?
So comprehensive sex ed does improve the health of our children. It does delay onset of first intercourse. It prevents pregnancy. It prevents sexually transmitted disease. We know that comprehensive sex ed improves health for our families. Good sex ed provides knowledge of the biology. It gives us the information that we need to make clear decisions based in biology. What sex ed doesn't have to do is talk about values, right? That's the family's job. Our job as educators is to provide the underlying biological information. And your job as a parent is to decide how that applies to your kids. So when your kids come home from sex ed, you can talk about, in our family, our value is that we wait until marriage. Or in our family, we think that it's important that you be in relationship for this amount of time or be this age or whatever your family values are around that. That's your work to do as a family. But kids getting that underlying biology is just important as them being able to, budget and analyze an essay. These are just important skills for being a person with a human body.
I love the way you explain that, the difference between, providing the information and then the values. I think that it's one of the best ways I've ever heard that explained. So thank you for that. Misinformation, though, surrounding sexual health, like anything, misinformation, disinformation, is just floating around out there like crazy right now. What are the most common myths you encounter, and how do you think we can correct those?
It's hard for me to tell you about myths, because more than myths is just a total lack of knowledge. It's hard to even have a myth if most people don't even know that the reason they're getting their PAPs is for HPV. Most people don't know that they're eligible for HPV vaccine at any age. Like, people just, they don't even know what's out there. So when it comes to myths, like, they don't even have enough information to come up with the wild story. There's myth that the vaccine is harmful. When we're talking about, vaccine hesitancy in the school system, people will often say things like, well, I heard a friend's kid got the vaccine and then they got sick. But many of the things that are described and things like that are illnesses that are likely to present at that age anyways. And if you look at the data around that, in a place like Japan, there was in 2013, there was quite a public uproar about, the vaccine is causing harm to our children. And so they stopped the vaccine program, the public vaccine program. And in the year when the vaccine was given, they actually had more instances of young people becoming ill than in the year that they didn't vaccinate. Right? So we tend to take these ideas that are based on worry about our families and blame whatever pattern we can find, whatever action that has been taken or that we took, we tend to blame these things on. I guess the myth that it's not going to matter to your kids because they're only going to have one sexual partner. But all you need is one sexual partner. Or, the heartbreak of your young person being assaulted where they didn't have control over their exposures. So regardless of the values that you teach your children in your family, this virus is everywhere. If you're out in the dating world or if you're, at risk, you're going to get it.
Any advice for parents who are struggling with how to talk to their kids about sexual health?
There's some great resources out there. Planned Parenthood in the States has some really great advice for parents and information, videos, and ideas about how to have these conversations. From my standpoint, my children are 17 and 19 now. And we started talking about sex and sexuality very, very early. Because again, it's the biology. They start to get the emotional overlay as they come into their teenage years, right? In those years when, oh my God, Mom, why would you talk to me about that? But if you start establishing those biological norms, where babies come from, how we ask consent before we hug our friends, how we just behave and interact as families and people in a world where humans reproduce, you have those conversations when they're little, that by the time they're 11 and 12, you're like, hey, remember we talked about how babies are made, and that's the context here. And they're like, oh, right. That totally makes sense. I never put it together that when you were talking about sex to make babies, that's this thing that kids are talking about when they're dating and attracted to people. But they already know the information. You've already put it in their brains in ways that stick. They might not get the context of it, but that information is there. And as it comes up, it no longer becomes this overwhelming emotional piece. It's like, oh yeah, I got that.
You just triggered a memory for me. You know, when my kids were young, my cheeks hurt. I'm laughing so hard right now because when they were little, we had a book from American Girl called The Care and Keeping of You. And it really broke down a lot of those, things about the body that parents might find uncomfortable in a way that was digestible for younger kids. And just the conversations we had were hilarious at the time, but it was just fun to have my kids, engaged in the conversation in a way that was completely on their level. And it really sort of made it easy for me. So I would highly recommend that book as a starting place for any conversation around the body of young girls. And I'm sure there's a version for boys out there somewhere. So anyway, that triggered a great memory. So thank you. If there was one thing though that you would like to say to the government, what would that be?
We need to be vaccinating. We need funded vaccine for everyone up to age 26. And we need funded vaccine for targeted populations who are at risk at any age. That includes people who've had abnormal pap tests in the past. It includes people who are on immunosuppressant medications. It includes people who have multiple partners. It's a tragedy that we're not putting this vaccine in places where it's most needed and making sure that all of us and all of our families are protected. My job should be obsolete. My waiting room should be empty, right? Every patient that I see is a failure of our vaccine program.
Well, let's get you there. Let's get you to out of a job. And I think that we should strive for Australia's success in this regard. So it's been a pleasure having you on. And I know you're always sharing great information. So where can people find out more? And is there a place on social media that they can connect with you?
Yes. So my website, drkimalexander.com, DRKIM Alexander.com, has all of so I write a monthly newsletter. You can sign up with your email there. And all of my past articles are archived there as well. Also, some of the podcasts that I've been on before. So there's lots and lots of information on the website, as well as links to my socials. The only one that's not on there is Threads. You can find me on Threads at Dr. Kim Alexander.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was incredibly enlightening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to share it with someone who'd love it too. And don't forget to hit subscribe to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, on your favorite podcast app. It's the easiest way to stay connected. Want more? Sign up for my newsletter at whatshesaidtalk.com to get all the latest updates, and let's keep the conversation going on social. You can find What She Said on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll find me on Threads, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Candace Said. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.
What happens when we play outside? We become healthier, both mentally and physically. We become more creative and more focused. We connect with nature, each other, and ourselves. Let's Take This Outside, a new podcast hosted by me, Marianne Iveson, an aspiring outdoor athlete and nature lover. I speak to athletes, outdoor professionals, and scientists about their connection to nature, how it affects their performance, and everyday life. Let's Take This Outside, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and at letstakethisoutside.ca.
I'm Jeff Woods, and I'm shining a light on music and the rock stars who make it.
He just was one of those people, he stood out.
He was a magic guy. He really was a magic guy. We all have faults. He had the same amount of faults as we all had.
This was before Led Zeppelin. Robert was full on. I mean, he was Led Zeppelin without the band behind him. He had the hair, the jeans, the whole thing, you know, and he was amazing.
The Records and Rockstars podcast, heard around the world and yours to hear wherever you get podcasts. All the episodes from jeffwoodsradio.com.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.